This is a tune that kind of kicked off the Upside Down Flowers writing process for me. It's a song about a trip I took with my family crossing the country, moving from the Midwest to the West Coast. It's called Ohio. On the razor's edge, at the first sign of light, the car was back. Well, the house was quiet and my sister slept. As we started the drive to California, where it's warmer, gonna start a new life. Gonna miss Ohio, but this time we're gonna get it right. Station wagon, tigers flying, Katie's counting crows for her, tears in her blue eyes, street lights and capitals go rushing by us, trying to find the station on the radio. Everything's gonna be better on the West Coast. On the northern plains, and I read the maps as the prairie grass moved in the wind like waves, and we can't look back. There's some men you just can't save. We had our reasons for leaving. It's better this way. I'm gonna miss Ohio, but I'm not. I'm gonna miss the rain. Station wagon, tigers flying, Katie's counting crows through her, with tears in her blue eyes, state lines and capitals go rushing by us, trying to find the station on the radio. Everything's gonna be better on the West Coast, better than the mess that we left back home in Ohio. There's magnets pulling from the ocean floor. I can't forget the way you looked when we were leaving. Tigers flying, Katie's counting crows through the tears in her blue eyes. State lines and capitals go rushing by us. I'm trying to find the station on the radio. Everything's gonna be better on the West Coast, better than the mess that we left back home in Ohio. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, this is cool. When I got this invitation, I was like, what would Google want to do with me? But I'm glad that y'all invited us out. We've had a good few days in Boston. Got to play House of Blues last night, which was a blast. What do you think? Should we do maybe Fire Escape? This is This is rock and roll morning, just so you guys know. So let's get the high notes out of the way. See how we do. This is about a long weekend in New York City where there wasn't much sleep going on. It's called Fire Escape. acrobat in broken ocean place like that, with life and taxis flying past. Tore that dance all down. Pocket change and subway cars, our big ideas filled empty bars. We might be from the moon or Mars. Either way, I'm never going home. So let's hang an anchor from the sun. There's a million city lights, but you're number one. You're the reason I'm still up at dawn, just to see your face. We'll be going strong with the vampires, baby. We belong away, swinging from the fire escape. I was drinking from the wishing well, some junkie metal at hotel. We poured in the carousel, the roof was caving in. And on the stage, my ex-boyfriend was singing songs about the end, the beggars in the lion's den, dropping lines like beggars in the snow. So let's hang an anchor from the sun. There's a million city lights, but you're number one. You're the reason I'm still up at dawn, just to see your face. We'll be going strong with the vampires, baby. We belong awake, swinging from the fire escape. Swinging from the fire escape. Swinging from the fire escape. Walking home, your hand in mine, tattoos on the river line. The morning birds are taking flight. Either way, I thought you should know. You're my number one. You're the reason I'm still up at dawn, just to see your face. We'll be going strong with the vampires, baby. We belong awake. You're my number one. You're the reason I'm still up at dawn, just to see your face. We'll be going strong with the vampires, baby. We belong awake, swinging from the fire escape. 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 Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's a fine cappuccino bar you have here, I must say.
Yeah, I mean, I would be so jacked on caffeine if there was a free latte every time I turned a corner.
After my second cappuccino, I applied for a job, so put in a good word for me.
Yeah, so Bob and Zach both have been talking about how they're putting in their applications today. I'm not sure. At least if your schooling will get you further than the cafeteria, I certainly know mine wouldn't. I'm just kidding.
Whoa.
Bobby went to way more school than I did, and Zach is.
It seems like the happiest place on earth. After the cafeteria experience too.
There's a burrito waiting for them in the dressing room. This is Bobby
Burrito
Raw,
heaven.
Bob Anderson here on the guitar, Mr. Zachary Clark on the keys. I figured we'd do another new song. This is probably one of my favorites off the new album. I think doing what we do for a living every day, you kind of wake up and it's like a little bit of a gamble. Maybe this music business will be here for us tomorrow or not, but I think as I've been very fortunate to do this for 18 years in 3 different bands, I should probably stop asking that question and just enjoy it. At least that's what my wife tells me. So this one's called Paper Rain. I got an old black limousine. I packed my suit and pawned the last of a precious metal. And my blue eyes never look so green. Yeah, I got a debt to pay and a day with the devil. I got mouths to feed. I gotta get level. Oh, Las Vegas, I'm running out of time, and my youth is all but ashes. If I don't make church by night, I'll be praying on the drive past the lake as fake as a shoulder's lashes. And I'm gonna turn my luck around. I'm gonna take this down. I'm gonna walk these flooded streets like a king with my umbrella out. Yeah, I'm gonna turn my luck around. I'm gonna make you proud. I'm gonna walk these flooded streets like a king with my umbrella out. And the people rain pouring down. People rain pouring down. I rented a room at the Desert Queen. I shaved my face, I combed my hair, and I checked the weather. And I see clouds where the mountains meet. The valley floor where the neon soars like a hand to heaven. I got work to do, rolling them sevens. Oh, Las Vegas, I'm running out of time, and my youth is all but ashes. If I don't make church by night, I'll be praying on the drive past the lake as fake as a showgirl's lashes. That I'm gonna turn my luck around. I'm gonna take this down. I'm gonna walk these flooded streets like a king with my umbrella out. Yeah, I'm gonna turn my luck around. I'm gonna make you proud. I'm gonna walk these flooded streets like a king with my umbrella out. And the people rain pouring down. The people rain pouring down. Got a stack on the line and a stack behind, rolling like a wave on a moonlit night. Money on the 4, money on the 8, paying down the market cause the bank won't wait. Got a stack on the line and a stack behind, rolling like a wave on a moonlit night. Money on the 4, money on the 8, paying down the market cause the bank won't wait. I'm gonna turn my luck around. I'm gonna take this down. I'm gonna walk these flooded streets like a king with my umbrella out. Yeah, I'm gonna turn my luck around. I'm gonna make you so proud. I'm gonna walk these flooded streets like a king with my umbrella out. And the people rain pouring down. People rain pouring down. So the last tune we'll do for you is a song that I wrote, 2014, I guess maybe. It was right before my daughter was born. I ended up in this writing session with two guys I had never met before, but then my a friend of my publisher said, like, these guys are great. You should hang out. And I had to like kind of give the caveat when I was on my way up to the session, like, my wife is within weeks of giving birth. Like, I may end up having to leave at some point in the middle of this little session. And it sort of became the decision when we walked into the room, like, okay, well, let's just write that. Let's write a song for this new kid that's gonna come into your world. And that song changed a lot for me, which is crazy. I've done this for a lot of years, like I mentioned. I've played in a lot of bands, and I sort of wrote this song as like an introduction of myself to my soon-to-be baby girl. And interestingly enough, for a lot of people, it became the introduction to me as an artist altogether, because it was really the first song I ever had that got substantial radio play and a lot of exposure on. So
she's a good luck charm for more reasons than one, and she turned 5 last week, which is crazy to me. But yeah, so this one is called Cecilia and the Satellite.
I locked myself in a hotel room, then waited all night for the walls to move. I've loved some girls that I barely knew. I made some friends and I've lost some too. Crashed my car, I was 17. My mother in the seat right next to me. The things I've learned from a broken mirror, how a face can change when a heart knows fear. For all the things my eyes have seen, the best by far is you. If I could fly, then I would know what life looks like from up above and down below. I'll keep you safe, I'll keep you dry. Don't be afraid, Cecilia, I'm the satellite, and you're the sky. I've cafe crawled through Amsterdam, been around the world with a punk rock band. And I've seen London and I played Japan. I've been knocked down, I got up again. For all the places I have been, I'm no place without you. If I could fly, then I would know what life looks like from up above and down below. I'll keep you safe, I'll keep you dry. Don't be afraid, Cecilia, I'm the satellite, and you're the sky. And you're the sky. I'm the satellite. And you're the sky. For all the things my hands have held, the best by far is you. If I could fly, then I would know what life looks like from up above and down below. I'll keep you safe, I'll keep you dry. Don't be afraid, Cecilia, I'm the satellite, and you're the sky. You're the sky. I'm the satellite. You're the sky. You're the sky.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Bob and Zach, one more time. Thank you, guys.
Put in a good word for us in the application process.
For the record, they both have much higher education than I do.
I'll get right to work on your job applications. So,
Yes,
yeah.
please.
So I wanted to talk to you a bit about the inspiration for your album, which has one of the coolest album titles, I think, Upside Down Flowers. So I was reading on your site, you said that you called it that because in many ways it's a mirror to my world, an uncanny reflection, but not quite the real thing. Could you talk a little bit more about like that uncanny nature of reality?
Yeah, you know, what's interesting about the genesis of this record was that
a lot of times you start records and you know you're starting a record, or you know you're in the process. And instead, with this album, I had this rare moment where after 2 full records of touring and creating, I had like a few months off at home, which is something that since I started this project I had not had in a while. And the process began with I watched this documentary Abstract, which I don't know if you guys have seen this on Netflix, but it was a documentary about just creatives and the different threads of success through their creative lives. And the one thing that struck me, and I've always known to be true, but it's easy sometimes to forget when you are an artist who tours like we do, that you've got to put yourself in the position to create every day. And when I got home and had this block of time, I think usually what I might do is take a couple weeks and just sort of flounder and hang out with the family and see old friends. And I did all that, but my daughter was finally school age, so I started working in the back house studio where I wrote this record, and just created my own writing practice based around the day. And what ended up creeping up were a combination of these memories, like the one you heard in Ohio, which is very much in a way like kind of a vivid portrayal of something that happened to me when I was a kid, to a song like Paper Rain, which was, I think, true in some senses philosophically about this idea of living life as a bit of a gamble, but was very much a story that kind of came to me in the middle of that writing process and became this story of somebody else, but somehow a piece of me existed in there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I found Ohio very moving, both like figuratively and literally, as it talks about your move from Ohio to California. And I know you referred to it as sort of a pilgrimage for you. So what did that mean for you as a child, like moving from the Midwest out to, the land where it's always sunny and warm and all that?
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, like my family, we were all in like a bit of a tricky time. Around then, I was about 11 or 12 years old, and we had sort of gone on the roller coaster of like having done very well, and then had kind of lost everything to some extent. And we had family on the West Coast. It was like those were the cousins we always went to visit in the summertime, and it was a great summer. Every summer you're like, oh, I grew up kind of Midwest, East Coast, but we could go to California for the summers. And in a sense, it always felt like the promised land to me, and when we found ourselves with so little, it just made sense to go be with my mom's family on the West Coast. And I think for me, like as hard as that time was, and for my family as hard as it was where we sort of rebuilt our lives and built a new story for ourselves. And for me, it was the place where, I was able to really explore my songwriting. I had written for years prior to our move there, but this was like the place where I built my first band. I found like those kind of close friends that when you're somebody who moves every 3 years as a kid, you don't get to make those close connections. And I think it did feel, and still does to this day, it's like it's not my native home, but it's about as native a feeling as I know is the beach towns of Southern California.
So, like a lot of people probably in the audience, my favorite song of yours is Cecilia and the Satellite, which you just played, and you gave a little bit of the background in it. But it's such a beautiful love song, but what's I think so special about it is we don't hear a whole lot of rock love songs from parents to children. Yeah. It's usually a different kind of romantic type of song. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the genesis, and also like how does your daughter feel about it? Do you play it for her a lot? That sort of thing.
Any song that references her, my daughter is a huge fan of. I'm sure that is going to change within the next 4 or 5 years. But as of now, I mean, even on Paper Rain, there's that lyric, like I've got mouths to feed. I'm gonna get. My daughter goes, "That's my mouth you have to feed." You're like, "Thank you, Cecilia." Yeah, and she knows. She's as keenly aware of where she fits into my catalog now. Yeah, for me, and I'm sure we can touch on this at some point. Cecilia is a product of a very tricky time in my life. I'm a cancer survivor, and I was sort of rendered infertile as a part of that treatment. I apologize to get a little gross here for you all, but there's this kind of joking story that I've told if you've been to one of my shows. It's not really a joke. It's true that in the process of being a sick person, finding out that you're going to be infertile, at least for me, I was lucky to have a doctor to say you've got to like bank your sperm, and that's gonna, maybe one day you'll have a family. And I was like, I don't care. I was 22 at the time. I was just like, that's not really of interest to me right now. Like, let's like load me up with the chemo, whatever, and like let's kill this cancer. And eventually what ended up happening was like, he was like, I won't treat you if you don't do this. So I did. And, miraculously years passed and my wife and I got to this place where like, we do want to have a kid. And we went through this IVF process and I met this little person, and I think in a weird way, telling that story and meeting my daughter was the thing that kind of closed the loop on my cancer experience, was because I met the most important person in my life, or one of them, because of that experience. And so I think when I was writing that song, I felt all of those things. That's why instead of it becoming like just a ordinary love song, it really became like me trying to educate my daughter on the person I had been, the things that I had seen, and let her know that that those peaks and valleys in life are gonna come to us all. But also that my hope was that I could be there to walk that road with her, as much as humanly possible. And I love that it became my biggest song, because there are oftentimes people in this business that will try and force you into like the lowest common denominator to reach the most amount of people. And what I found is like historically what's been successful for me has been the most specificity and the most sort of leaning into my story and trying to find those tangible threads, those universal threads have been what have kind of led me to the largest audience.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that like when you get more specific, it becomes universal at the same time sometimes too. So I can't imagine what that was like, getting a cancer diagnosis that young, and I'm sure that greatly impacted not just your life, but the trajectory of your career, just in terms of going through that experience, being a survivor. Do you feel like that has affected like all of the music you wrote since?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dangerous game of survivorship is trying to look at your life as these sliding doors, and saying, well, gosh, if that hadn't happened, where would I be now? And I think it's taken me years to sort of unlearn that mentality and say, well, this did happen, this is the way that your life went. But it took me a lot of years to figure out, like, no, just as you build good memories on the other side of some trauma, that becomes your life, and that can be a really beautiful existence. But certainly it worked its way into my creative process. It worked its way. I mean, it was hard to create after being sick. I went from being like this fearless, like, I made these records and I had gotten successful at such a young age that all of a sudden now I had this, like, this ghost in every room with me going, every decision became much trickier to make. It was like everything became life or death after seeing life and death and in that, in that frame at a young age. But it's taught me a lot, and I at this point I wouldn't trade it, so much, like I said, has happened because of it, and I've been able to, make a lot of change and try and, raise a lot of money for people who have been in my position, and that's been really rewarding work for me.
You're definitely an inspiration to a lot of people, having gone through that and continuing to create afterwards. So on a lighter note, I learned that you're an amateur mixologist. You just kicked off a new video series on YouTube, The Rocktail Hour. Could you talk a bit about that, your interest in cocktails and your hobbies?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I got a buzz on at home one night, and these phones, as we all know, sometimes you'll maybe shoot a video that you shouldn't shoot when you've had too much to drink. And I think it was like a margarita. Like I have like a house margarita I make that I was just like, all right, kids, here we go, and it just turned into this thing for my fans there, that they loved that window into my world. And I think that's a lesson learned for me as somebody who is not a early adopter of technology, but somebody who very much like has to be like thrust, and forced, like manager going, you need to post on Instagram, and now I do, and I love that stuff. But yes, we started this series. A buddy of mine has a bar in town where I live, and he wrote all those recipes and was behind the camera going, now you do this, now you do that. Like I make like 3 drinks well and then quickly forget them. But yeah, it's fun. It's a nice meditation at the end of the night for me to like just make a single drink for myself and enjoy.
We have some time for audience questions. If anybody wants to come up to the mic and ask questions.
First off, thank you so much for joining us. This, as one of your fans who loves a little bit of a window into your life and the creative process, much appreciated.
Thank you.
You talk about how you've been in all these different projects and bands, and you've gone through a lot of life changes. You talked earlier about being that 22-year-old kid who, whatever, I don't care about a sperm bank right now, just treat me. Obviously, your creative process and style and musical style has changed a lot over those years. Who you are has changed a lot over those years. As a musician, though, the music that you've made is permanent, right? It's on record, and there's some expectation that you perform that old music from time to time. What is that like for you, being a very different person than that person that wrote those old songs?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I look at all of the chapters of, my first band, Something Corporate, Jack's Mannequin, this record. I don't necessarily look at them as different people, maybe different lives to some extent, or different chapters of a life. And sure, there are some songs from my back catalog that maybe I don't favor or would rather not play. But what's interesting is I find that the ones that are enduring and the ones that people talk about the most, those are the ones that matter to me the most. Kind of speaking to this idea of when you write something that feels very true to yourself, even if it's in some sort of like fledgling state or some moment of growth, those things still feel relevant. When I play those songs, and we do quite a bit of back catalog in my set. It's always kind of like a combination of the newest record. Certainly I try and lean heavy on whatever project I'm working specifically. So there's a lot of Wilderness songs in the set, but the other half of the set is kind of a mashup of the bigger songs from Jax and Something Corporate, and then then sort of the ones on the outskirts that I like the most or that fans talk about the most. And playing them live, it still feels good. If it doesn't, then I generally kind of jettison those, or I try and find different ways. There's a song called Punk Rock Princess from like when I was in high school, and we're doing it like with a full band for the first time in forever, because this record and this tour is sort of a bit of a nostalgia bent because of the album itself is so reflective. But with that song, like I've been doing that as a ballad on and off for the last few years, and as a ballad, I feel like the earnestness of being young and what it is to sort of pursue somebody who doesn't like the same music that you like, which I think is still like I can still identify with that somehow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Like, I sort of stole my question, but it's more about just your evolution of music over the years. I mean, I feel like there's pieces that seem like very Something Corporate-y, but then obviously you've changed a lot through life experiences, etc. I'm just curious how, what you learned and what you experienced in the Something Corporate days, how that impacted you when it went to Jack's Mannequin and now your solo career, what pieces you took with you, what you kind of maybe discarded. Do you miss that period of time? And then what's next? What's next on your kind of trajectory here with music?
Yeah, I mean, well, to the first part, I think like any of us, we're trying to evolve, and I think that's sort of been my biggest target, is just don't settle and don't stay, and that's why I've continued to change project names, and people kind of hate me for it on some level, because they're like, oh, new band, okay, but hysterically most of the time I have a lot of the same players or producers or whatever all involved in this thing, and it's just more about delineating time for me. The things I take from the Something Corporate era for me is just about I think about collaboration. I wasn't a great collaborator in those days. I think I was a very guarded collaborator when I started. You're a kid in high school, and you and your best friends, you're making a record together, and all of a sudden, then it blows up, and then it gets political or whatever it is, and I'm still close with all those guys because I think we did what a lot of bands and a lot of our contemporaries didn't do, which they stayed in it long enough to hate each other, where it's like we did the most mature thing we could have, which was like, we're best friends, we're not getting along so well, let's take a break. And I think what I've tried to learn over time, and I think really in a large way what the Wilderness is a reflection of, is how in those first two projects, Something Corporate and Jack's, how I had I could carry a chip on my shoulder, which is just not a healthy way to try and create or build anything. If something didn't go right, or the launch of an album or a single didn't take, I would be pointing fingers, and and with collaboration, again, I was a little bit more of a jealous collaborator. I was always guarded, and with this project, it really became about opening myself up. You know, not being afraid to get in a room and write with somebody who I admired or respected, not being afraid to travel here or there, meet this producer, or listen to what a trusted manager had to say about a song because they want me to win. You know, and I think those are the big lessons of now. And I think a lot of that is just age and getting older and saying, like, what do you want to walk through life, you know, with your fists up all the time, or do you want to sort of move through it in a peaceful way? And I'd say those are the big lessons I learned from the early days. As far as what's next, I'm not 100% sure. I'm in that bizarre flux moment now where this tour feels like it's doing an amazing job of like rounding out this project. I don't think I'm walking away from this project, but there's some talk about maybe doing some scoring work and some film and television stuff when I get home, and working on some other projects for people who are not just myself, but actually contributing to some other avenues creatively. So time will tell, but I'll always be making songs.
Awesome. Thanks for
Cheers,
stopping
man.
by.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
My friend introduced me to your music like 15, 16 years ago, and my girlfriend, it was one of our first dates, went to your show.
Really? Where?
I think it was, I can't even remember.
Was it in the area
in Boston,
though?
yeah.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
Yeah. And we've been married now for 10 years, and we've got 3 kids. My 7-year-old daughter, her favorite song is Fire Escape, and we sing it to her almost every night.
Love that.
But the question that I want to ask is, my son is 11 years old, and he's getting into music a lot. He's taking piano lessons and guitar. What advice would you give to the parent of someone who really wants to get into music?
The best advice that I can give at this point is to do what my parents did, which, you know, my parents just supported me. You know, they never really drove the whole, you have to go to lessons. I eventually asked for lessons because I was writing, and then I started by writing, like I learned a couple chords, and that was the beginning of my writing adventure. And then after about a year of that, I couldn't make any new sounds or shapes with my fingers. And so I asked for lessons. I mean, they were diligent about trying to make sure I went and that I didn't waste their money. But you know, I think about my mom, like when I started writing songs, it's like all the other kids were playing sports, you know what I mean? And my oldest, I'm the youngest of 5, all my older brothers and sisters were great athletes. I was not a good athlete. And instead my parents saw that I had a passion and they backed it. And, you know, my mom like looked up music producer in the Yellow Pages when I was 10 years old and drove me to Dayton, Ohio. And I like worked in this guy's like little home studio, which was a fairly new thing at that point, and made a 3-song demo tape, you know, and it wasn't very good, but they sort of always believed in me, you know, and believed that it was possible when other people were like, oh, your kid's going to be in a band. And, you know, when I was not gearing up for college, I think there was a lot of judgment there from other parents, and they just said, this is his passion, and they backed it, you know. And so I just would say, with anything, music or otherwise, you know, if your kid's got a passion for something, you know, I learned a lot from my parents in that sense, that they backed me 100%, you know, and let him learn songs he wants to learn. That's what I would say. You know, it's important that they can make the connection of why they're learning music to why they love music, you know, and you know, sometimes classical is a great teaching tool. But I'd say for like what I did was every classical song I learned like a Billy Joel tune, and I made my teacher do that. And she was a scary, scary woman, and somehow she still let me do it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks so much for everyone for coming. Go buy his album Upside Down Flowers, or listen to it on YouTube Music or your favorite subscription service. And thanks again.
Thank you. I appreciate you.